Linda Carter, a 73-year-old retired schoolteacher, walked into First Pacific Bank on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The bank was busy, filled with customers waiting in line, the sound of pens scratching against paper, and the occasional ding of the service bell. Clutching her worn-out purse, Linda slowly made her way to the counter, her hands slightly trembling, not just from age, but from the anxiety of dealing with financial matters she didn't fully understand. She had noticed unexpected charges on her checking account, small deductions that, over time, had added up to a significant sum. Living on a fixed pension, every dollar mattered to her, and she couldn't afford to lose money without reason. With a polite smile, she approached the teller, a young woman named Brittany Wallace, and explained her concern in a gentle, wavering voice. Brittany barely looked up from her screen. With an air of impatience, she sighed and said, "These are standard fees, ma'am. There's nothing we can do." Linda frowned. "But I don't understand. I've never had these fees before. Could you please check again?" Brittany exhaled sharply, clearly annoyed. "Like I said, they're standard. If you don't want to pay them, maybe you should read the fine print next time." A few customers nearby turned their heads, sensing the tension in the air. Linda felt her face grow warm with embarrassment. She wasn't asking for special treatment, just an explanation. "I've been banking here for years," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I at least speak to a manager?" At that moment, Carl Jensen, the bank manager, stepped out of his office. He was a tall, middle-aged man with an air of self-importance. Without even offering a greeting, he walked up to Linda with crossed arms. "Ma'am, we don't make exceptions. If you can't afford the fees, perhaps you should consider banking somewhere else." The words hit Linda like a slap. She swallowed the lump forming in her throat. Was this really how they treated loyal customers? People who had spent their lives working, only to be brushed aside in their old age? Just as she opened her mouth to say something, anything, a deep, familiar voice rang out. "Is that how you talk to your customers?" The room fell silent. Everyone turned toward the source of the voice. Standing near the entrance, arms crossed, was none other than Vin Diesel. Linda blinked in shock. The famous actor had been waiting in line like everyone else, but now, he stepped forward, his expression calm yet firm. The bank manager's confident stance faltered as he recognized the celebrity. "Sir, this is a private matter," Carl began, but Vin Diesel wasn't having it. "No, it's not," Vin interrupted. "It's a matter of respect. This lady came in here asking for help, and you're treating her like an inconvenience. That's not how you do business." Carl glanced nervously at the other customers, who were now murmuring among themselves, nodding in agreement. Brittany, the teller, suddenly looked down at her screen, avoiding eye contact. "I just want to understand the charges," Linda said quietly, her voice carrying more confidence now that someone was standing up for her. Vin turned to her and smiled reassuringly. "And you have every right to." Then, he faced Carl again. "So? What's the problem? Why can't you check her account properly?" Carl hesitated, then let out a forced chuckle. I suppose we can take another look." "Yeah," Vin said, nodding. "I think that's a good idea." Under the watchful eyes of Vin Diesel and an entire room of customers, Carl had no choice but to comply. He gestured for Brittany to pull up Linda's account. After a few minutes of awkward silence, Brittany's face paled. "There was a mistake," she muttered. "Some of the fees shouldn't have been applied." Vin raised an eyebrow. "You don't say." Carl cleared his throat. "We'll reverse them right away," he announced, trying to regain control of the situation. But Vin wasn't done. "Not just for her," he said, his voice unwavering. "How many other elderly customers have been charged unfairly?" A murmur spread through the bank. Some customers began checking their statements. One man in his 60s stepped forward. "Wait a minute, I've been charged those same fees too." Carl's face turned red. He knew there was no way out now. With Vin Diesel standing there like a guardian of justice, there was nothing he could do but agree. All affected customers will have their fees reversed, Carl finally admitted, his voice tight. The tension in the room lifted, replaced by a sense of quiet victory. Linda exhaled in relief, her hands no longer shaking. She turned to Vin Diesel, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Vin gave her a warm smile. "No need to thank me, ma'am. Just looking out for people who deserve better." A customer nearby pulled out a phone and started recording, capturing the entire moment. Within hours, the video went viral, exposing the bank's unfair practices. Social media exploded with praise for Vin Diesel's kindness, and First Pacific Bank soon released a public statement promising to review its policies. As for Linda, she walked out of the bank that day with her money restored, not just in her account, but in her heart. She had come in feeling small, but she left feeling seen, valued, and most importantly, respected. Margaret Thompson, a frail 78-year-old woman, carefully stepped into Greenfield Bank on a chilly Monday morning. The cold wind outside had made her joints ache, but she was determined to resolve an issue with her bank account. Dressed in a simple beige coat that had seen better days and clutching a worn-out handbag, she moved hesitantly toward the counter. Her hands trembled slightly as she held out her bank statement, her heart pounding with anxiety. She had noticed some unfamiliar charges on her account, money she could not afford to lose. Living alone on a fixed Social Security income, every dollar was precious. The bank was crowded, and Margaret felt a little overwhelmed by the fast-moving transactions around her. People were coming and going, clicking away on their phones, chatting with tellers, or waiting impatiently in line. She gripped her handbag tightly, silently rehearsing what she would say. When it was finally her turn, she stepped forward and offered a tentative smile to the young teller behind the counter. "Good morning, young man," she said, her voice polite but slightly unsteady. "I believe there might be a mistake with my account. There are a few charges here I don't recognize. Could you help me check, please?" Ryan, the teller, barely looked up from his computer. He let out an audible sigh and glanced at the long line of customers behind her. His tone was flat, indifferent. "Ma'am, these are standard charges. If you don't understand how banking works, maybe you should get someone younger to handle this for you." Margaret's heart sank. A warm flush of embarrassment spread across her cheeks. She wasn't asking for much, just a little clarity, a little patience. She adjusted her glasses and peered at the paper in her hand. "I've been banking here for over 30 years, she said softly, trying to remain composed. "I just need to understand what these deductions are for." Ryan rolled his eyes dramatically and tapped his fingers on the counter. His voice was louder now, deliberately condescending. "Like I said, ma'am, these are standard deductions. It's your responsibility to keep track of your own money. We don't have time to explain every little thing." A few customers in line turned their heads at the sharpness in his tone. Margaret felt their eyes on her, her sense of dignity crumbling under their gaze. Her lips quivered slightly, but she pressed them together, willing herself not to let the tears spill. She wasn't trying to cause trouble. She just needed help. Seeing her hesitate, Ryan let out another exaggerated sigh and shook his head. "If you're confused, maybe ask a family member to explain it to you next time. We're really busy here." Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat, her vision blurring. She was old, yes, but she wasn't incapable. She had handled her own finances for decades, had worked hard all her life, and had never been spoken to like this before. The humiliation of being treated like a burden in front of a crowd of strangers made her hands tremble even more. Before she could respond, another bank employee, Claire, the supervisor, walked over. Margaret hoped she would offer some assistance, but instead, Claire merely crossed her arms and regarded her with a disapproving look. "Ma'am, if you're going to hold up the line and cause a scene, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." The words hit Margaret like a slap. She wasn't causing a scene. She wasn't shouting or demanding anything unreasonable. She was simply asking for help. But the way they looked at her, as if she was a nuisance, an inconvenience, made her feel small, invisible. A thick silence settled around them. The weight of humiliation pressed down on her frail shoulders. With shaky hands, she gathered her papers, nodded stiffly, and turned away from the counter. She kept her head down as she shuffled toward the exit, her once steady steps now hesitant and weak. Just as she reached the door, a voice rang out. That was completely uncalled for. Margaret turned slightly, blinking back tears. A young woman who had been watching the entire exchange stepped forward, her eyes blazing with indignation. No one deserves to be treated like that, especially not an elderly woman just trying to get help. A murmur of agreement swept through the line. Another customer shook his head in disgust. Someone else pulled out a phone and began recording. Ryan and Claire exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly aware of the growing attention. By the time Margaret reached home, she was exhausted, emotionally and physically. The experience had drained her. She sat by the window, staring out at the gray sky, the sting of humiliation lingering like a wound that wouldn't heal. Unbeknownst to her, the video of her mistreatment at the bank spread quickly online. Outrage poured in from thousands of people who condemned the bank's behavior. Under intense public pressure, Greenfield Bank was forced to issue an official apology, and both Ryan and Claire were placed under review. But for Margaret, no corporate apology could erase the shame she had felt that morning. The pain of being dismissed so easily, of being treated as if she were insignificant, was something no bank statement could ever fix. It was a typical afternoon at a downtown Los Angeles bank. The air buzzed with the sound of typing, murmured conversations, and the occasional rustling of paperwork. Customers stood in line, some glancing impatiently at their watches, others scrolling on their phones as they waited. Behind the counters, bank employees processed transactions, their expressions indifferent as they worked through the long queue. Among the crowd was Margaret Thompson, a frail but dignified 78-year-old woman. She clutched a neatly folded bank statement in her slightly trembling hands, her brows furrowed in concern. There were unfamiliar charges on her account, and she had come in for clarification. With a polite yet hesitant smile, she stepped forward as her turn arrived. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I think there's a mistake on my statement. Could you help me understand these deductions?" The bank teller, a young man named Ryan, barely looked at her as he took the paper. He let out a short sigh, his fingers tapping impatiently against the keyboard. After a quick glance at the numbers, he pushed the paper back toward her. "These are standard fees, ma'am." "Nothing's wrong," he said flatly. Margaret leaned in slightly, her eyes scanning the paper again. "But I don't recall authorizing these withdrawals. Could you please explain?" Ryan cut her off with an exasperated tone. "Ma'am, if you don't understand basic banking, maybe you should have a family member help you." A flush of embarrassment crept up Margaret's cheeks. She had always prided herself on managing her own finances. For decades, she had handled every bill, every transaction, without needing anyone's help. But now, she was being treated like a burden, like someone who was simply too old to comprehend. "I just need a little clarification," she said, her voice quieter now. "That's all." Ryan rolled his eyes. He crossed his arms and spoke louder, as if raising his voice would somehow make his impatience justified. "We don't have time to explain every little thing to customers who can't keep up." The words hung in the air, sharp and humiliating. A few customers looked over, some with sympathy, others pretending not to notice. Margaret's fingers tightened around her statement. She felt small, insignificant, and for the first time in a long while, powerless. Then, a deep, commanding voice cut through the tension. "That's no way to treat a lady." The entire room seemed to freeze. Heads turned toward the source of the voice. Standing just a few feet away, with his muscular arms crossed and a steely gaze locked onto Ryan, was none other than Vin Diesel. Dressed simply in a fitted black t-shirt and jeans, his presence was unmistakable. Though he wasn't towering over anyone, his sheer presence made him seem larger than life. The intensity in his deep-set eyes was enough to send a shiver down Ryan's spine. Ryan swallowed hard. "Sir, this is a private matter." Vin took a slow, deliberate step forward. His voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "No, it's not. You made it everyone's business the second you decided to humiliate this woman in front of a crowd." Margaret looked up at him in astonishment. She had seen him in movies before, but never in a million years had she imagined he would be standing up for her like this. By now, the other customers were paying full attention. Some discreetly recorded the scene on their phones. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Ryan, visibly flustered, opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. His confidence had evaporated under Vin's unwavering stare. Vin glanced at the bank manager, who had just rushed over after sensing the tension. "I suggest you train your staff better," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "No one should have to beg for basic respect." The manager, beads of sweat forming on his brow, nodded hastily. "Of course, Mr. Diesel. I sincerely apologize for any mistreatment." He turned to Margaret with a nervous smile. "Ma'am, let's step into my office. I'll personally assist you with your account." Margaret, still shaken but deeply grateful, managed a small smile. She looked up at Vin Diesel, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, young man. I didn't expect anyone to stand up for me." Vin's tough exterior softened as he smiled back. "Family takes care of each other. And we're all family." The bank staff scrambled to make amends. Ryan was quickly pulled aside for disciplinary action. Meanwhile, the video of the encounter spread like wildfire on social media. Vin Diesel wasn't just an action hero on screen, he had proven that real heroes step up when it matters most. The tension in the bank was palpable. Customers and employees stood frozen, their eyes darting between Vin Diesel and the nervous bank manager. The elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, still clutched her purse tightly, her frail hands trembling slightly from the humiliation she had endured moments ago. The manager forced a polite smile, though his eyes flickered with unease. He cleared his throat and straightened his tie, attempting to regain control of the situation. "I assure you, Mr. Diesel, this was just a misunderstanding," he began, his voice overly formal. "Our staff is trained to assist customers efficiently, but with the high volume of requests we receive, sometimes interactions may come across as abrupt. I deeply regret any miscommunication." Vin Diesel remained silent for a moment, his intense gaze locked onto the manager. His jaw tightened, his posture firm. When he finally spoke, his deep voice carried a quiet, controlled anger. "Miscommunication," he repeated, his brow furrowing. "That wasn't miscommunication. That was blatant disrespect." The crowd murmured in agreement. A few people nodded, while others exchanged glances, their faces filled with a mix of frustration and anticipation. Vin took a slow step forward, his towering presence making the already uneasy manager shift his weight uncomfortably. "She asked for help. And instead of treating her with kindness, your employee made her feel like she was an inconvenience," Vin continued, his voice unwavering. "An elderly woman, standing in your bank, struggling to understand a process that should be simple, and instead of patience, she got humiliation." Mrs. Thompson lowered her gaze, as if recalling the moment she had been dismissed so callously. Her lips pressed together, her embarrassment still fresh. The manager swallowed hard, his forced smile beginning to fade. "Mr. Diesel, I understand your concern, and I sincerely apologize. We will certainly review our staff training procedures to ensure this does not happen again." Vin let out a slow breath, shaking his head in disbelief. He folded his arms across his broad chest, his expression growing even more intense. "Training procedures," he scoffed. "This isn't about training. This is about basic human decency. A bank is supposed to serve its customers. But instead, what I saw today was arrogance. Disrespect. A culture where the people who need help the most are treated like burdens instead of human beings." A hushed silence followed his words. The weight of his statement hung in the air, undeniable and heavy. One of the tellers, the same one who had dismissed Mrs. Thompson earlier, shifted uncomfortably behind the counter. His face was pale, his hands twitching slightly as he avoided eye contact. The manager inhaled sharply, clearly realizing that there was no easy way out of this. He forced another stiff nod. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Diesel," he admitted, his voice quieter this time. "I take full responsibility for what happened today, and I will personally ensure that it never happens again." Vin studied him for a long moment, his sharp eyes searching for sincerity. Then, with a slight nod, he turned to Mrs. Thompson. His expression softened as he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Come on," he said, his voice kinder now. "Let's make sure you get the help you need." The elderly woman looked up at him, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible but full of emotion. As the bank scrambled to correct their mistake, the message was clear: this wasn't just about one woman's bad experience. It was about respect, about standing up for what was right. And Vin Diesel had just made sure that no one in that bank would forget it. The atmosphere in the bank shifted after Vin Diesel's strong challenge to the manager. The room, heavy with the tension of the confrontation, suddenly seemed to hold its breath. The manager, his face a mix of embarrassment and disbelief, remained frozen, his gaze shifting between the customers and his staff. It was clear that his authority was being questioned in front of everyone, and the pressure was mounting. But then, as if sparked by Vin's bold intervention, a low murmur began to ripple through the crowd of customers. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a few hushed voices from the back, voices of people who had witnessed the injustice but remained silent up until now. But one by one, they began to speak up, their words growing stronger with every passing moment. The first to stand was an elderly man, his back slightly hunched with age but his eyes sharp with frustration. He gripped his cane tightly and tapped it once against the floor to get attention. "This isn't right," he said, his voice steady but tinged with the weariness of years spent dealing with similar treatment. "I've been banking with this place for over 20 years. I've seen it all, the long lines, the cold shoulders. But this is beyond the pale." He shook his head, his words clear and forceful. "I may be old, but I'm still a paying customer, just like anyone else. And I won't tolerate being treated like this." The woman in the blue dress, who had been silently observing, was the next to speak. She placed her hand on her hip and looked directly at the manager, her eyes burning with indignation. "I had the same problem last week," she said, her tone sharp. "I came in for help with my account, and the teller barely looked at me before sighing and pushing me off. It's disgraceful. We shouldn't have to beg for decent service." Another man, dressed in a sharp business suit, joined in. His voice, though calm, was laced with frustration. "It's not just about this woman here. It's about the service we all get. You come in, and no one bothers to ask if you need help. No one greets you. It's like we're invisible until it's time to pay fees." He gestured around the room. "This is a pattern. It's not an isolated incident. And it's happening more and more." The murmurs grew louder as more people in the bank began nodding in agreement, their eyes meeting one another, no longer willing to remain silent. They had all witnessed or experienced the same lack of respect, the same dismissive attitude from the staff. Their voices rose in unison, each person adding weight to the collective frustration. Vin Diesel, standing tall in the center of it all, turned to the crowd with a small but approving nod. His eyes, fierce and determined, scanned the room as he spoke again. "See? This isn't just about one woman. This is about how everyone in this room, regardless of their age or how much money they have in their account, is treated. We all deserve respect. We all deserve help when we ask for it." His voice was firm but carried a sense of empathy that made the customers feel seen, heard. Mrs. Thompson, still standing near the counter, her hands trembling slightly around her purse, felt a small spark of hope ignite within her. She had come in feeling humiliated, abandoned, and alone. But now, with the voices of so many people rising in support, she felt something shift in her chest, relief, perhaps, or even a hint of pride. She wasn't alone in this fight. A woman in the back of the line, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up. "I've been coming here for years, and every time I try to get help, I'm treated like I'm bothering them. I'm sick of it. We all are." Her words were simple but powerful, and they carried the weight of years of unspoken frustration. The bank manager's face flushed red, his earlier bravado quickly crumbling as he realized the gravity of the situation. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of so many accusing eyes. I understand," he stammered, his usual authority no longer present. He wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers and nodded quickly. We'll make changes. Starting immediately. We hear you." His voice was weak, rehearsed, and the customers could see right through it. But no one in the bank was backing down. Not now. Not after all the years of mistreatment. Vin Diesel glanced around at the gathered crowd, his expression resolute but satisfied. "Good. It's about time," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Now, let's make sure this lady gets the service she came here for." He gestured toward Mrs. Thompson, his eyes softening just for a moment as he gave her a reassuring smile. The tellers, who had been standing silently behind their counters, seemed to snap into action. They no longer looked bored or uninterested. Now, they seemed flustered, but at least they were moving. A teller rushed forward to help Mrs. Thompson, her earlier reluctance replaced by an urgency to make things right. The room began to hum with a sense of collective victory. The energy that had been so tense moments before had shifted, as if the bank itself had been forced to reckon with its own flaws. The customers, no longer quiet and passive, had found their voices, and they weren't going to let anyone ignore them. They had reminded the bank, and themselves, that respect wasn't just something to be earned, it was something that was owed. The air in the bank grew thick with tension as Vin Diesel's words cut through the murmurs of disbelief that had been building in the room. His presence, usually associated with powerful action scenes, now commanded the space with an undeniable calm and focus. The bank manager, visibly sweating, tried to regain control, but it was clear he was no longer in charge. This was no longer a conversation about a singular instance of poor customer service, it had become something much larger. Vin's gaze swept across the room, his expression serious and unwavering. He could see the confusion and frustration on the faces of the people gathered there. They had come in seeking basic services, expecting a smooth transaction, but what they had encountered was something far more insidious, the everyday exploitation of the vulnerable by a system designed to take advantage of them. "Listen," Vin began, his voice calm yet filled with the weight of his conviction. He knew he had to cut through the noise, to make them understand. It's not just about the way you were treated today. It's about what happens here every single day. What happens when people like Mrs. Thompson, or anyone else who doesn't have the strength to fight back, are pushed aside and forgotten? What happens when the bank decides that your time, your money, your dignity don't matter? Vin paused, taking a slow breath, letting the full weight of his words settle in. The room fell into a tense silence. People shifted uneasily, but no one spoke, as if they were waiting for him to say more, waiting for something that might explain why they had been so mistreated for so long. "This isn't a fluke," he continued, his tone growing more impassioned. "This is a system. A system that thrives on treating you like you don't matter. A system that counts on you just accepting whatever they give you, because, what else can you do? You're not supposed to speak up. You're not supposed to question how things are done." The bank manager shifted uncomfortably, trying to make eye contact with Vin but failing. It was as if the words Vin spoke were too direct, too cutting to ignore. The manager's earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by an unease that spread throughout his body. But Vin wasn't about to stop now. "This is how it works," Vin said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "They make you wait, they make you feel small, they make you feel like you don't deserve their time. They assume that, because you don't have the power or the platform to fight back, you'll just go along with it. But that's where they're wrong." Vin stepped forward, his body leaning slightly toward the bank manager, as if to emphasize his next words. "This isn't about one bad employee or one bad experience. This is about the whole system, the policies, the rules, the very structure of this place. It's set up in a way that benefits them, not you. And it's been this way for too long. The whole game is rigged, and they've been counting on you to stay silent. The manager opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was paralyzed, unable to defend the indefensible. And in that moment, something shifted in the room. Customers who had once been uncertain, unsure of whether it was worth speaking out, now felt a spark of clarity. Vin had named the problem. They weren't just dealing with poor service, they were dealing with systemic injustice. Vin's eyes locked onto the crowd, his expression intense but not hostile. You think you're the only ones who've been treated this way? You think Mrs. Thompson is the only one who's been ignored or humiliated because she doesn't know the right words to say or the right way to ask for help? No. This is happening everywhere, every single day. And it's not just banks. It's companies, corporations, industries, all exploiting people like you and me. He could feel the growing energy in the room, the shift from frustration to something else, something more powerful. The customers were beginning to understand that their struggles weren't isolated incidents. They were a part of a much larger issue, a system that sought to keep them small, to keep them powerless. Vin took a step back, his gaze now moving from the manager to the group of customers. You deserve better than this. You deserve respect. You deserve transparency. You deserve a system that works for you, not one that only works for the people at the top. But you can't get that if you keep accepting the way things are. You have to demand change. He turned back to the bank manager, his voice unwavering. You want to fix this? Start by looking at the bigger picture. Start by holding people accountable. Start by creating a culture that values its customers, not just their wallets. Start by treating people like they matter, not just when there's a camera on you, but every single day. The room was still, but it was no longer silent. There was a quiet but palpable sense of empowerment. The customers, once hesitant and unsure, now stood taller. They had been given a voice, and more importantly, they had been shown that their voices mattered. The manager, still reeling, could only stand there, his face flushed with embarrassment and guilt. But there was no turning back now. The truth had been exposed, and the customers, armed with this new understanding, would no longer tolerate being taken for granted. As Vin turned to leave, he offered one last word to the manager. This is just the beginning. You can either be a part of the change, or you can get out of the way. And with that, Vin Diesel, the man who had challenged not just the system but the very way it operated, walked out of the bank, leaving behind a group of customers who would no longer accept being exploited, and a bank manager who would never forget the lesson that had been taught. Carl's hands shook slightly as he stood behind the counter, eyes fixed on the computer screen. The weight of the room bore down on him. His face flushed with a mixture of frustration and embarrassment as he glanced nervously at the customers who had witnessed his earlier arrogance. The voices of Vin Diesel and the crowd still reverberated in his ears. The powerful words about the systemic issues in the banking system, the injustices that had allowed him to treat people like Mrs. Thompson so coldly, had stripped away any illusion of control he had once held. He was no longer the authority he believed himself to be. He was a man caught in a web of his own making. The truth was undeniable. The reversal of the charges wasn't just a small correction, it was a moment of reckoning. Carl had been forced to confront everything he had been protecting, the rules that prioritized the bank's profits over its customers' rights, the policies that allowed people to be mistreated without consequence. And now, it all hung on his decision. He could feel the heat of the customer's eyes on his back, every gaze heavy with judgment. There was no escape from it, no quick fix. Carl had been cornered, and he could either stand his ground in arrogance, or do the right thing. The pressure weighed on him more than he'd expected. He wasn't just facing a few angry individuals, he was facing a collective shift in power. Vin had reminded him of something Carl had buried long ago: he wasn't above reproach. His position at the bank, the power it gave him to wield authority over others, had only been a facade. And now, he was exposed. What had started as an attempt to shut down Mrs. Thompson's reasonable request had spiraled into an impossible situation. A room full of strangers now held the power to witness him either do the right thing or crumble beneath the weight of his own arrogance. Carl inhaled deeply, his chest tight. Mrs. Thompson stood nearby, her expression calm, but there was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself. She hadn't demanded an apology, she hadn't needed to. She had been humiliated, but her resilience had won the room over. He knew now that this wasn't just about reversing charges, it was about restoring some sense of fairness and justice to the situation. But for Carl, it was about more than that. It was about the realization that he had, for too long, turned a blind eye to the ways his actions had hurt others. His fingers hovered over the keys. The hesitation wasn't just because of the task at hand. It was the sinking feeling that doing the right thing, reversing the charges, meant admitting that the very system he represented was flawed. And in doing so, he'd have to confront a painful truth: he had been part of the problem. The sound of the keys clicking seemed almost too loud in the tense silence, each stroke an uncomfortable acknowledgement of the pressure mounting inside him. His hand trembled slightly as he confirmed the reversal. He glanced up at Mrs. Thompson, and for a moment, their eyes met, an unspoken understanding passing between them. She had been waiting for this, waiting for him to make things right. She didn't need his apology, but Carl knew it was the only thing left to offer. When the transaction was finally complete, Carl handed her the receipt, his voice quiet. "I've reversed the charges. I'm sorry for the trouble this caused," he said, the words feeling hollow in his mouth. He wasn't sure if he meant it yet, but he had to say it. He had to acknowledge what had happened, even if it felt forced. Mrs. Thompson accepted the receipt without a word. Her face remained neutral, but Carl could see the flicker of relief in her eyes. She wasn't angry, there was no triumph in her. This wasn't about winning for her. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through what she had endured. The battle had been won, not by force, but by the quiet resilience of someone who had been wronged and refused to let it slide. Carl's shoulders sagged as he stepped back from the counter. He felt drained, physically, mentally, emotionally. His actions had been exposed, and no matter how much he wished to pretend they hadn't been, the truth had been laid bare for all to see. The room, which had been tense moments before, seemed to shift. The customers who had watched in silence now exchanged looks, some nodding in approval, others simply watching Carl with a mix of disbelief and expectation. They had witnessed a man crumble under the weight of his own arrogance and a system that had long since stopped caring for those it was meant to serve. As Carl took a step back from the counter, his eyes darted across the room, meeting the gazes of the customers who had once seemed so distant, so powerless. The shift was palpable. They weren't just passive observers anymore. They had found their voices, had spoken up, and Carl had no choice but to listen. But listening was no longer enough. The realization that this moment of forced accountability, had to mean more than just undoing a single transaction settled heavily on his chest. This wasn't just about Mrs. Thompson. This was about every person who had ever been mistreated by a system that had prioritized profit over humanity. And now, Carl was beginning to understand, he couldn't go back to how things were. As the customers began to leave, their murmurs of approval still ringing in the air, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. His world, his carefully constructed world of policies and rules, felt less solid, less reliable. For the first time, Carl wasn't sure he wanted it to be. He knew this was only the beginning. The system that had allowed him to act this way, unchecked, unchallenged, was crumbling around him. And he was left to reckon with his own part in it. This was just the first step. The moment the video hit the internet, it spread like wildfire, drawing in millions of viewers within hours. What had started as a small, seemingly isolated incident at a local bank, a confrontation between an elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, and a dismissive bank employee named Carl, quickly turned into a much larger conversation about systemic inequality. The video captured Vin Diesel, a well-known actor typically associated with high-octane action roles, standing up against an institutional abuse of power. His actions, speaking out against Carl's mistreatment of Mrs. Thompson, confronting the bank's hidden practices, and calling attention to the way society often overlooks the vulnerable, struck a chord with viewers everywhere. For Vin, what began as a spontaneous, impulsive decision to intervene had now become something he could never have predicted. He had simply been in the right place at the right time, a witness to an injustice that tugged at something deep inside him. But as soon as the video went live, he realized it was no longer just about helping one person. It was about something far larger, about a societal shift, a moment when people started questioning the ways they were being treated by institutions that had long held power over them. As the video spread, it didn't just accumulate views, it sparked intense conversations on social media platforms. People from all walks of life began sharing their own stories of mistreatment by large corporations, especially in the banking sector. The hashtags #Justice for Mrs. Thompson and #Banking Reform quickly began trending. For Vin, this wasn't about fame or accolades. He didn't even expect his actions to be recorded, let alone become the focal point of a global conversation. But now, it felt overwhelming. It was as if the whole world was watching him, analyzing his every word and gesture. He could hear the voices of people thanking him, people telling their own stories of how they had been mistreated. And there was also the growing sentiment that something needed to change, not just at that specific bank, but in the larger systems of power that perpetuated such abuses. Vin's role in the incident was no longer just about him being an actor playing a part in a fleeting moment. It had become a moment of reckoning for him personally. He had always been someone who advocated for fairness in the stories he portrayed on screen, but this was real. This was the world he lived in. And the ripple effect of his actions, small as they seemed in the moment, had now grown into something far beyond his control. He felt a mixture of pride, but also a deep sense of responsibility. The words he had spoken to Carl about fairness, about standing up for the underdog, had transcended the confines of the bank and became a call to action. He couldn't simply walk away from it now. He had to be part of something bigger. On the other side, Carl, the bank employee, was swiftly becoming the villain of the piece. As the video spread, the once quiet banker's name was plastered across screens worldwide. His arrogance, the dismissive way he had treated Mrs. Thompson, and his failure to recognize the injustice he was part of became the focal point of intense online scrutiny. People began to dig into his past, uncovering previous complaints about poor customer service, and soon, Carl was the punchline of countless memes and online jokes. The more Carl watched the video spread, the more his anger and embarrassment mounted. How had something so small, just a routine transaction gone wrong, snowballed into an online storm that was now threatening to ruin his life? At first, Carl couldn't believe it. His confidence, built on years of working in the bank with little challenge or accountability, was starting to crack. It wasn't just the public shaming, it was the recognition that everything he had believed about his position in society, his control over the situation, was being called into question. People weren't just angry with him, they were angry with the system that had allowed him to act with such impunity. And they weren't going to let it go. The bank, once a towering institution with unquestioned authority, now found itself in damage control mode. Press releases, statements of apology, and even interviews with the CEO flooded the media, but it was clear that words weren't enough. The public had seen the truth, and what mattered now wasn't the hollow apologies, it was accountability. The viral video had stripped away the facade, and the damage done by Carl's actions could not simply be wiped away by a press statement. The calls for change grew louder, with people demanding that the bank not only reverse the charges against Mrs. Thompson but also take action to ensure that this kind of behavior would never happen again. For Vin, watching the fallout unfold was a mix of satisfaction and discomfort. He had never intended for things to escalate this far, but now that they had, he felt a strange sense of duty. He didn't want to be seen as a hero, he had just done what any decent person would do. But there was something about the way people were reacting that made him realize how much power a single act of courage could have. It wasn't just about standing up for Mrs. Thompson, it was about standing up for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of larger systems that ignored their rights. The day after the video went viral, Vin found himself flooded with messages, some from fans, others from complete strangers, all thanking him for his actions. He began to feel the weight of it all. His simple act of kindness had touched a chord with so many, and he was beginning to understand just how deep the problem ran. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a reflection of the broader inequalities that ran through society. His role in this moment, this unexpected heroism, was now part of a larger narrative about the need for change. As the video continued to gain views, the conversation around it didn't stop with the reversal of Mrs. Thompson's charges. People started talking about bank reform, about customer service, and about how institutions needed to be held accountable for the ways they treated their clients. The video had shifted something inside the public consciousness. It had exposed not only one individual's wrongdoing but a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. And with every share, every comment, every post, Vin realized that he had become part of something much bigger than himself. It was no longer just about the video. It was about the beginning of a movement, a call for people to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed like no one else would. The aftermath of Carl's actions hit him like a storm. Initially, he tried to downplay the viral video, thinking that the public's outrage would quickly fade. However, as the days dragged on, the pressure mounted. Carl had underestimated the power of social media, and the consequences of treating people with such disregard. Every time he checked his phone, there were more messages, more posts about his behavior, more mentions of his name, all steeped in anger and judgment. The comments on his personal social media accounts were a cruel reminder of the public's fury. People from all over the world condemned him, calling him out for his behavior and questioning how he could treat a vulnerable elderly woman in such a heartless manner. His inbox flooded with furious messages, some telling him he'd ruin his career, others threatening him with harm. The first few messages Carl tried to ignore, but as they piled up, the weight of the situation started to sink in. He began to feel like the entire world was watching him and judging him. His attempts to shut it out only amplified the anxiety that gnawed at him day and night. But the worst was the growing distance between him and the people he cared about. Friends he'd known for years began to turn away, too embarrassed to be associated with him. His own family was quiet, too quiet. He could sense their disappointment without them needing to say a word. The shame that crept over him was almost unbearable. Every time he walked into a room, he felt like the air was thicker, heavier with unspoken judgment. It seemed like no one could look at him without seeing the viral video, the smugness in his actions, and the cruelty in his words. At work, things were no better. He had expected the usual routine, his colleagues nodding curtly and getting back to their own tasks. Instead, people avoided eye contact. Even his once friendly coworkers seemed uncomfortable around him. Whispers followed him wherever he went, their words punctuated by the stares of people who once respected him. The reality was inescapable, he was a pariah in his own workplace. No one wanted to be associated with him, and no one trusted him anymore. It wasn't long before the manager called him into his office. Carl's stomach twisted as he walked down the hallway, his steps heavy with dread. The door to the office was closed, and the silence inside felt suffocating. Sitting across from his boss, Carl noticed the tired look in the manager's eyes. The man, who had once been a mentor of sorts, now seemed almost as broken as Carl felt. "We've been getting calls, Carl," the manager said, his voice low, not unkind, but firm. "From customers, from corporate headquarters. It's not just the video. It's the anger, the complaints, the demands for accountability." Carl tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had nothing to say that could defend his actions, nothing to explain why he'd treated Mrs. Thompson like that. His shame consumed him. "You've put this branch in a terrible position, Carl," the manager continued. "We can't afford to be associated with this kind of behavior. Corporates decided to place you on leave while they conduct an investigation." The words felt like a punch in the gut. Carl wanted to protest, to plead, but he knew it was pointless. The damage was done. There was no coming back from this, no way to repair the damage to his career or his reputation. His heart sank, and all he could think of was how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. The thought that he could lose his job for good settled heavily in his chest. Back at home, the isolation began to eat at him. Carl had always considered himself tough, able to handle any challenge, but now, faced with the fallout from his own actions, he felt small, vulnerable. Every time he picked up his phone, his stomach churned. The comments and messages were relentless. Even the people who had been his supporters, his friends, his co-workers, seemed to be turning away from him, distancing themselves from the person they thought they knew. As the days passed, Carl tried to bury his guilt with distractions, but it didn't work. The weight of what he had done, what he had allowed himself to become, was inescapable. It wasn't just the video. It wasn't just the angry messages or the loss of his job. It was the realization that he had become a symbol of everything wrong with the system, everything wrong with how people were treated, how institutions like banks prioritized profits over people. He had exposed a dark side of corporate culture that many had overlooked. Now, Carl was left to reckon with the reality of his actions. No matter how much he tried to defend himself or explain it away, the truth was undeniable. He had taken advantage of his position, humiliated an elderly woman, and ultimately shown the world just how deep the problem ran. What had seemed like a minor slip-up in the moment had now become the catalyst for something much larger. As Carl sat in his apartment, staring at the walls closing in on him, he knew that the consequences of his actions were far from over. The investigation would likely result in a termination. His reputation would follow him wherever he went. There would be no escaping the stain of his own choices. In that moment, Carl felt a mixture of guilt, regret, and the harsh realization that the life he had built was crumbling, all because he had failed to see the consequences of his own arrogance.